everyone, welcome back to the part 2 of my video on the theme of ascension, and this time I wanted to finish off what I started out saying I would talk about, which is how ascension relates to the experience that is known as mental illness. And for some of you that might be a formal diagnosis, or it may just be the fact that you've been going through a lot of emotional, psychological, mental distress, and you can relate to some of the issues that people with diagnosis of mental illness have. And you might have been thinking also that your experiences are not necessarily wrong or bad or dysfunctional. They might be very uncomfortable, but there may be a part of you which knows that they're benefiting you in some way. So that's what I want to talk about today, how the ascension process that the whole of the mother of our earth and all of us on it are going through, and how that's affecting us psychologically. So if you haven't already watched part 1 on ascension, please do, because I gave it my best shot in summarizing what is a very complex topic, and there's a lot of other speakers on the subject, books, amazing resources that you guys can look at to help you understand ascension better. But for the moment, trying to tie in those two subjects that are my passion, because I have had the last 10 years of my life consumed by recovery from severe mental illness diagnoses. I don't like to talk about myself in terms of diagnosis, but just so that people understand the context, I have had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and then as I started to work on my recovery and feel my feelings more, I had another diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. And then as those feeling states became more and more conscious, I had a third diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder. So I've really gone through a very quite intense journey of recovery, and for several years incapacitated, so wasn't able to work, to really function very well at all. And it was quite a dark and scary time for me and my darling husband, who was my witness, my compassionate witness, my best friend, my carer at times. And my best friend really through that journey. That journey has been spiritual in its essence, and I always knew that deep down, but didn't have support around me, context to really be able to make use of that understanding, because I understand it's very distressing when you're going through this stuff, and to be told a spiritual platitude like it's just meant to be and it's your soul's journey and all this kind of thing, it's all lovely, but often what time you really need practical support then. I mean, I needed hospitalization, and as much as I don't like pharmaceutical drugs, I was on quite a number of them to contain that distress. So yeah, it's been an interesting and full-on journey. So that's the lived experience that I speak from, and I'm an expert in myself. I'm an expert in my journey. I'm not necessarily an expert in anyone else's journey. So whatever I say today, hopefully there's one little gift for you, and some insight or something that sparks the truth in you that you can follow, because that's really what it's all about at this time in our collective journey, is that we're each of us claiming our own truth and claiming our sovereignty, our mastery over our journeys. We don't need other people to tell us what is true for us. But oftentimes we can really support each other through collective sharing, through this sharing, teaching, learning, which is what's happening so much on the internet now, and that's why I'm making these videos, to be a part of that community, which has been so helpful for me. So I'll talk now about this mental illness idea. So I've been working in mental health for about 6 years, in acute care in a hospital, as well as in community mental health, with the typical range of people going through mental distress, and anyone who works in mental health will know that it affects everyone and anyone. It doesn't matter what your background is, your education, your ethnicity, your how much money you earn. I mean, yes, there's correlations between disadvantage to show that increases perhaps risk of abuse, trauma, situations that can cause, you know, exacerbation of mental illness like poverty, debt, that kind of thing. But nonetheless, there's this enormous spectrum of people. It can touch anyone. So knowing that, and knowing the incredible diversity of experiences, you can't ever say mental illness is this. The biomedical model does try to do that, and has done for many years now, to say mental illness is a chemical imbalance, or depression is related to lack of serotonin, or there's correlations, but that's all they can ever be, because it's so complex, it's so holistic. It deals with all the at least four layers of self, which is the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual or etheric. So these layers and levels of self all work together. It's an orchestra, a symphony. Unfortunately for some of us, it becomes an out of tune, discordant symphony. So it's not sounding very good, and it certainly wasn't sounding very good for me when I was going through these experiences called mental illness. However, there is a proliferation of mental illness at the moment on the planet, and borne out, by studies that have shown it's risen. It's being even called an epidemic by some writers and thinkers. I'll maybe put Robert Whitaker's book down in the link below. He writes a really good exploration of mental illness, very critical of psychiatry, not so much psychiatrists, but the drugs, the pharmaceutical treatment of mental illness, only because it's so narrow and so limited. But nonetheless, epidemic, right? It's rising constantly, and the stats are quite terrifying on how many people are diagnosed or have been put on pharmaceutical medication to treat these, what really, in my opinion, are natural phases, states of consciousness that we have to go through on our journey in ascension, in a natural evolution of spirit, of our own spirit. So they can look very pathological to the untrained eye, and that's why I'm making this video, to help contextualize a little bit why this distress might be going on, and why we need to trust the process. Whatever the treatment is that we give ourselves, still at the deepest level to trust it. So one of the reasons people may experience mental illness, or psychological distress as I prefer to call it, it's a little bit less stigmatizing and a little bit less pathologizing. One of the reasons is that right now, as I explained in part 1, ascension process on the planet is causing a rise in consciousness. And as we expand our consciousness, that expansion creates awareness of self that wasn't there before. And in that state of awareness, we see at what we would call the shadow, the negative aspects of self. Now, I talk a lot about this as well in other videos. Journey to Integration is a 3-part video on looking at the shadow aspects of self and how to integrate them, how to own them, how to bring them back into the fold of your heart, and come to have compassion for all parts of you, no matter what, whether negative or positive. So for a lot of us, this is enormously challenging, because we will have been trained not to look at those parts of ourselves, and because of our society and our parenting, and it's like a conditioning that's happened on the planet, to not want to look into the dusty, dark corners of our own psyche, and B, because it's painful. We don't want to look in there because it's uncomfortable and shows us all the things we've been perhaps avoiding. So expanded state of consciousness as a natural evolution can show us these very things that we really didn't want to know about, which can end up being called a mental illness. So, one result of seeing our negative flaws is depression. It can bring up a lot of really intense emotions like grief and shame and guilt and regret, sense of failure, personal self-loathing. These things are not pleasant to sit with. And depression, one way of seeing it is that it's kind of like a system shutdown. So the whole system, because it happens on a physical level as well, and science does show us that the serotonin levels drop, and other neurochemicals. Sorry, not being too much of an expert on how that all works, but I know the rudiments of it. So there is a physical component, but it's emotional as well, because our emotions are shut down too when we're going through depression. Anyone who's gone through depression will tell you it's like having a heavy grey blanket put over you, and you can hardly kind of breathe or think, and you lose all motivation, and you're not really even feeling anything. It's a sort of a state of non-feeling, and if there was a feeling, the closest you could perhaps call it would be hopelessness or despair. But even like true despair has a feeling quality to it. Like when we're really in despair, we're weeping and we're wailing, and that is an emotion, and that's very healthy to express these things. Whereas depression, it's sort of like maybe the feelings they started to come up in your consciousness, but for some reason you're not ready to deal with it. You need to wait till you have more tools. It's not the right time. You're really frightened. The reasons why a person might fall into depression are manifold. But underneath that depression will be something that needs to be dealt with, right? Now, when it needs to be dealt with is entirely up to you. I don't want to make anyone watching this video who is experiencing depression feel guilty, because that's the last thing you need, is more negative emotions piled on top of negative emotions. The ideal intention to set for yourself is one of compassion, trying to find a place of compassion for where you're at right now, because depression is probably one of, in my opinion, having gone through a whole gamut of symptoms and different experiences of mental distress, depression's probably the worst. I would take psychosis over depression. I'm not minimizing it at all. It's very, very serious, and it's life-threatening for people. So, incredibly difficult to deal with. But like I say, it serves a purpose in the psyche to perhaps insulate us for a while, until we're ready to face these things, until we're ready to feel our feelings. So it may also be a call to rest. So there might have been in your life prior to a depression a kind of a pushing of yourself, just to get through. Maybe you constructed a life which really wasn't that authentic for you. It wasn't really your true calling, or you didn't feel 100% comfortable. Depression can kind of be one way of our psyche stopping us, like crash, there we go. You are now forced to rest, and in that rest time, and it's not fun rest, but you're resting nonetheless, right? Because you can't really even get out of bed when you're feeling terribly depressed. It's time to reflect. So it has value, and every single experience you could ever have on this planet has value. That's a helpful thing to just reflect on while you're resting. So that might be one reason that the mental illness is calling you to stop and reflect. If you're going through more of a psychosis type experience, and I don't want to again label anyone or diagnose or even use medical language, but what I mean is chaos. Like your mind just suddenly feels like it's expanded greatly, and you're feeling very confused, perhaps very frightened. A lot of impressions are coming into your consciousness that do not make sense. You might be connecting dots and understanding things, but it feels threatening. You can feel like paranoia, extreme fear can come with those experiences. That's sort of the opposite of depression, whereas depression sort of constricts you and forces you to slow down and rest. The psychotic experience, or the expanded experience, it forces you to see all of this stuff and somehow deal with it, somehow integrate it and make meaning out of it. So it's a real opportunity to integrate. One way of integrating is to make sense of it, to make meaning. And when I was going through psychosis, that was really what I was doing for a good couple of years there. I was intensely focused on finding a story about why was I going through this, what did all the stuff in my head mean, what was my story behind it. And for me, it turned out to be a story about not feeling good enough, a story about deep emotional conflicts, a story about being very unhappy in my childhood, which I've done some other videos on that topic. It's not necessarily my parents' fault, and I definitely like to emphasize that because my view now is so expanded. I can see it's part of my soul journey. But nonetheless, there were big problems for me in my childhood, and that was the stuff I needed to sort out, and that was the stuff that came up into my consciousness when I went through a psychosis. As well, I was given a lot of information at that time about what's happening on the planet and, the darker forces perhaps that have had an agenda here on this planet, but also the good stuff, like the way that we are all interconnected mentally, the way that beliefs shape our reality. There was some empowering material in there as well, and I had to kind of sift through all of that. So that was also quite a scary time. Psychosis is definitely very, very frightening for people who go through it without guidance and context. And for a lot of us, that is in a medical model context, which doesn't really explain the depth of it. So for more on that topic, I made a video called Psychosis as a Spiritual Awakening, so please have a look at that as well if you're interested. So both of those examples, depression and psychosis, hopefully you can see that they're serving to push us into an expanded state of awareness, to bring our shadow feelings and beliefs up to the surface for us to deal with them. And that's essential work before we can begin to reap the rewards of this process called ascension, before we can start to feel safe within ourselves. Another function of mental illness right now on this planet, I believe, is that it's actually it's the canary in the coal mine kind of analogy. So you've got, I've yet to come across a person experiencing mental illness or mental distress that is not a highly sensitive human being. It's the sensitive souls that kind of can't handle the deception, the wrongs, the things that feel morally wrong on our planet. And when I say wrong, from the highest perspective, everything is serving a purpose and there is no right or wrong. But from a third dimensional earthly perspective, we can say inhumane treatment, brutality, abuse, the gap of the wealth, the haves and the have-nots, the scrambling for competition to have a bigger home or a better car, or the apparent injustices of when things do go wrong on life. Like, these things are really hard for the human soul, heart to process, because it doesn't feel like the world that we should and want to be living in. So for many of us, what we've tried to do is we've sort of grown up in this world and we've tried to fit ourselves into it, and we've become all sort of misshapen because of it, trying to fit ourselves into a world that is really essentially unhealthy and maladjusted and isn't serving the highest good. So the fact that we're getting sick is almost a reflection of our health. Like, I wonder if you can see how that can be flipped to that the people who are so-called mentally sick are actually the ones that are facing this, that are revealing the sickness, because the sickness for many eons now has been kind of out of sight, out of mind. A bit like, when there's some terrible secret in a family that festers and creates all sorts of ripples of negative feelings, shame and deception and lies, and yet no one talks about it. So it's been a bit like that on the planet now for a long, long time, that there's a lot of things wrong, and we're talking about it now because so many of us have to. That's the other thing about mental illness. It forces us to face this stuff. We can get so critically unwell that we have no choice, because it's either go completely mad, which is a form of escapism at its very extreme. People who are lost in a psychotic experience are on some level, not connected, not wanting to be connected. They lose their ability to participate in life. And so it's one way of kind of, I suppose, avoiding, and again, I don't want to, there's no judgment intended there, because we grow the way we do. If you can see yourself as like a plant, growing the way you're growing, and we don't look at plants and judge them and say, oh, that's a terrible rose, it's growing a bit sideways, a bit wonky, or it's got some spots on its leaves. Well, usually we look at the soil and we say, what soil is that rose growing in, and does it have a good position? Does it have enough sun? Does it have enough nutrients? We're like those plants. We also need a lot of things that we actually haven't been given. So if we are reacting in strong ways through illness, psychosis, even the suicidal impulse, it's natural and normal that we would be doing that. So there's absolutely no judgment, and only enormous compassion in my own heart for anyone suffering at that level. And I know I've been at that level, so I speak with love for myself and with love for you. So the suicidal impulse is very understandable under these conditions, that people would want to choose that option, because they cannot see how participating in this life could actually be, could bring them what they desire, peace. We all desire the same things. We desire to be in harmony. We desire peace. We desire to feel good. And part of the reason why that gets sabotaged by others or by ourselves is this conditioning, this programming, these negative beliefs and limitations that we're all working to unravel and resolve. And it has to happen within each of us. It's, if we suddenly had on the nightly news people telling us this is how you have to behave and what you have to think and all the rest of it, well, that would have an influence. I don't doubt it, because the news and the media does have an influence on us. But it still wouldn't matter unless you did the work yourself. It's it's something that each of us has to do inside. So working with your own symptoms or features or experiences, or whatever language you use to describe your negative experiences, that's your responsibility, your unique work that you're here to do. And when you do that healing work, you become an example then for others. Automatically you become a teacher, you become a light bearer, a love bringer. You bring hope, you bring love, you bring harmony, because you have created that within your own heart. And it's very powerful when you can get to that place. So if you're in the middle of a mental illness crisis, as tough as it is, I think for a lot of us, it's kind of, we have to go through that. We have to go through that dark tunnel, and you have to keep going if you want to get to the other end. And it's hard to sometimes know where the other end is, right? Because it may feel like you've been there for a long, long time. But the good news is, like I said in the first part of this video, the ascension energies now on the planet are really supporting our rapid growth. If we are willing, if we have the intentions in our hearts to heal and to be love, to embody love, then that will be given to us. That is possible now for you. So it's not all bad. It seems bad when you're in the middle of it, but the big picture, which is what I'm trying to share today, is that it's serving you, and it's serving humanity as a whole, and it's serving Gaia, our planet. One last thing I thought I'd mention too is this idea of like a passage that we have to pass through. One of the beautiful teachers that I follow, Matt Kahn, speaks about self-judgment. You know, it's this state of feeling like we're constantly berating ourselves, criticizing ourselves. Everything we do is wrong, and we all, until we get to a point of healing, we all live with that. Now, not all of us are conscious of it, and Matt Kahn describes kind of a spectrum where on the far end you've got people who are very judging of other people, who project outwards onto the external world, and everyone else is, you know, got the problem, everyone else is to blame, they're idiots, they're assholes, they're you know, evil, us and them mentality. Now that's an immature state of consciousness, but again, not to judge it, because that's where some people are at, and some souls are at, and if that's where they're at, that's where they're at. It's like I said, it's like no point judging a little baby rose compared to a fully grown bloomed rose. You know, they're at two different stages. So people here are just at that stage where they've externalized the negative judgments that are part of the negative programming on our planet. This is an inherited thing. It's inherited in our DNA. It's inherited from our past life karmas and experiences. So, you know, it is what it is. If that's where you are, that's where you are. But as you begin to expand and become self-aware, you start to move along the spectrum, and then something seemingly even worse happens, and you become judging against yourself. It's almost like that lens of judgment turns on you, and you start to see all of your flaws, all of your faults. It's an absolutely excruciating time to go through that. And sometimes that's what mental illness is this intense self-examination where you conclude that you're a great big mess and you've messed everything up, and look at you now. And you know, it's a yeah, I can laugh about it. I hope that some of you might be laughing as well, because I guess you know, I laugh about these things now about myself because I've grown and I've expanded to the next stage, and that's what this next stage will bring you. It will bring you lightness and peace, and you will find things funny that maybe were not funny once. So as you go through the self-judgment, right, you do pass out of that eventually, and you come to, and the end of the spectrum is you come to non-judgment, no judgment at all. Now, in that space, you're not judging other people, you're not judging yourself, you're not judging life, and all is peace, all is peaceful. There's a beautiful, one of my favorite quotes in the world is, everything will be okay when you're okay with everything. That kind of expresses, you know, what's at that end of the spectrum. It's this really beautiful place to be, of non-judgment. Now, you know, there were many years there where I didn't understand that. I didn't understand what that would mean. How could anyone have no judgment? Because there are bad things going on in the world. So, you know, from that perspective, yes, it looks illogical. But when you journey inside, and that's where the mental illness experience will take you if you let it, if you're willing to surrender to it. When you journey inside and you learn to not judge yourself, then the world then becomes a mirror to that, and you can drop the judgment. And then you realize it's not about, you know, just because you're non-judging doesn't mean you don't act, doesn't mean you don't speak, it doesn't mean I don't make these videos and I share what I think is helpful for other people. It doesn't mean I don't, use my dollar to invest in things that I think are ethical, or stand up for what I believe, or, write letters to politicians, or whatever it is that you do. You still act, but it's coming from a place of compassion for all and an understanding of the wider picture. So that's what this intense experience of mental illness can potentially birth in you, is this expanded consciousness, expanded compassion. It starts with compassion for self. That's where everything starts. This journey of ascension starts within, and is the bridge way to the fifth dimension, to this state of unconditional love which exists, as I was saying in the first part. So I can see my battery is not too far from finishing, so I don't want to have this video suddenly truncated, and it's already half an hour. So I don't know, there's probably so many questions or other things I could say about it, but I think that's probably quite a good summary, at least for my knowledge at the moment, and for the words that want to come out today, as they do here on this beautiful afternoon in Melbourne, Australia. So thank you for listening and bearing with me, and if there's something that you want me to talk about a bit more, let me know. Otherwise I'll just make another video when I'm inspired to, and trust that the words go to the right people at the right time, and vice versa. I send blessings to all of you who are watching and listening, in the hope that you will tune into your deepest truth and be able to then pass that on to others, because as I said in the last video, we're all in this together. It truly is a collective, unified experience at the fifth dimensional level, and it's one of the things that we were all dreaming of in our hearts is possible, is right here for us to take and enjoy and create together. So very exciting times. And yes, if you are in a dark place right now, and that's why you've tuned into the video, I'll just finish, I suppose, by honouring that time for you, and sending you my compassion and my love and my blessings, that you pass through it, that you find the value and the gift in it, and that you trust the process, and may it birth the next beautiful version of you that is awaiting. Namaste and love to you all. Bye.